My son treated me like I was dead for 8 long years, and the silence was so complete that some nights I wondered if I really had disappeared from his world. Then everything changed the moment my face appeared on time. The phone that had been silent for nearly a decade suddenly lit up with a message from my daughter-in-law inviting me to a family meeting, as if I had never been pushed aside at all. I stared at those words, knowing exactly why they were reaching out now. Success has a way of waking up the people who buried you. What they didn't know was that the man they abandoned was not the man who would walk into that meeting. I had built myself from the ground up, rebuilt a life from ashes they never bothered to check on, and I was done being silent. So I replied that tonight we would finally set everything straight. If you stay with me, you will discover the truth behind the 8 years they erased me from their lives, the humiliation they allowed, the betrayal they thought I would tolerate forever, and the moment I turned their greedy little plan upside down. This is not just a story of revenge, but of rising so far beyond the people who tried to break you that they can no longer recognize the person standing before them. Keep watching, because what happened in that so-called family meeting left everyone in the room stunned, and none of them saw the ending coming. My name is Walter Hammett. I am 70 years old, a retired high school history teacher who spent 34 years helping young people understand where they came from so they might better understand where they were going. I thought I understood loss when my wife Rosalind passed away 8 years ago, but I was wrong. Losing her was only the beginning. Her reading glasses still sit on the nightstand where she left them. I know I should put them away, donate them perhaps, let someone else see the world through those lenses. But every morning when I wake up alone in the bed we shared for 43 years, I look at those glasses and I can almost believe she just stepped out of the room. Her cardigan hangs by the back door, the soft blue one she wore when she tended her roses. Sometimes, when the house feels too quiet, I press my face into that fabric and search for any trace of her perfume. It faded years ago, but I keep searching anyway. I talk to her photograph every morning, the one from our trip to Maine, where the wind caught her hair and she laughed at something I said that was not even funny. I tell her about the weather, about what I dreamed, about how the roses she planted are still blooming even though I have no idea what I am doing with them. I tell her I miss her. I tell her I am sorry I could not make our son stay. Gavin, my only child. The boy I taught to ride a bicycle, to tie a necktie, to shake hands like a man. He lives 40 minutes away, but it might as well be 40 years. I have called him dozens of times since Rosalind died. Dozens. I stopped counting after the first year because the numbers only made the silence heavier. It is never Gavin who answers. It is always her. Marissa. My daughter-in-law speaks to me in a voice so polite it cuts like glass. He is busy with work, Walter. Sophie has activities today. We will call you back soon. They never call back. Not once in 8 years. I used to wonder if I had done something wrong, some unforgivable offense I committed without knowing. I replayed every conversation, every holiday dinner, every moment I could remember, searching for the mistake that turned me into a stranger. I found nothing. The truth, I eventually realized, is simpler and more painful. I was not worth the effort. An old man with no money, no influence, no usefulness. Marissa made her calculations and decided I did not add up to anything worth keeping. 2 years ago, I did something I am not proud of. I drove to their neighborhood, not to knock on the door or cause a scene, just to see Sophie, my granddaughter. She was 14 then. Walking to school with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. She has her grandmother's eyes. That same warm brown, that same way of looking at the world like she is trying to understand something just beyond reach. I sat in my car across the street, my hands gripping the steering wheel, and I watched her until she disappeared around the corner. I wanted to call out. I wanted to run to her and say, I am your grandfather and I love you and please do not forget I exist. But I was afraid Marissa would make trouble, afraid Gavin would tell me I was not welcome, afraid Sophie would look at me like a stranger because that is what I had become. So I drove home without saying a word, and I did not try again. The only person who treats me like I still matter is Linda Bowen. She is 72, a widow herself, and she lives in the yellow house next door. Every Thursday she comes over with something she has baked, and we sit in my kitchen drinking coffee and talking about nothing important. She lost her husband 6 years ago, and we share the quiet understanding of people who have outlived their purpose. We do not talk about loneliness because we do not need to. We both know what it feels like to set the table for one. That evening, I was sitting in my chair by the window, watching the light fade from the sky the way I do most nights, when my phone rang. The sound startled me. It rings so rarely now that I sometimes forget it works at all. I reached for it slowly, expecting a telemarketer or a wrong number, and then I saw the name on the screen. Gavin Hammond. I stared at it for 3 rings, my heart pounding in a way it had not pounded in years. My son was calling me. After 8 years of silence, my son was calling me. I answered with a voice I barely recognized as my own. The voice on the other end was my son's, but it did not sound like him. Gavin spoke in clipped sentences, careful and measured, as if he were reading from a script someone had written for him. He asked about my health, my diet, whether I was still driving. The questions came one after another without pause, without warmth, like items being checked off a list. I waited for him to call me Dad. He never did. Every sentence began with you. How are you feeling? Are you still living in the same house? Have you seen a doctor lately? The word Dad never crossed his lips, and its absence hurt more than I expected. I tried to ask him how Sophie was doing, whether she still played piano, whether she remembered me at all. But before I could finish my sentence, Gavin interrupted. He said he had seen something online about me and thought we should reconnect. The word sounded foreign in his mouth, clinical, like something a therapist had suggested. I asked him what he meant, what he had seen online, but he was already talking over me. Marissa will call you with the details, he said. Then he told me to take care of myself and hung up. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. I sat there holding the phone long after the screen went dark, trying to understand what had just happened. The next morning, I checked my email out of habit, expecting nothing but advertisements and notices from the pharmacy. Instead, I found a message from someone named Jennifer Walsh, a journalist with Time magazine. I read her name 3 times, certain I had misunderstood. She explained that their editorial team was working on a series about ordinary Americans making extraordinary differences in their communities, and they wanted to feature me. Specifically, they wanted to write about the literacy program I started 6 years ago in Rosalind's memory. It is a small thing, that program. After Rosalind passed, I needed something to fill the hours that used to belong to her. I remembered how she always talked about her grandmother, a Polish immigrant who never learned to read English and spent her whole life feeling like an outsider in her own country. Rosalind used to say that language was the door to belonging, and without it, people remained forever on the threshold. So I volunteered at the community center, teaching elderly immigrants to read and write in English. We meet twice a week in a small room with flickering fluorescent lights, and I help people decades younger than me learn to read grocery labels and street signs and letters from their grandchildren. It never occurred to me that anyone would care, but Jennifer Walsh cared. She wrote that someone had recommended my story to her personally. They said your wife would have wanted this. Those words stopped me cold. Who would say such a thing? Who even knew about Rosalind's dream for this program? I read the email again, searching for clues, but found none. She asked if I would be willing to participate in a phone interview and possibly a photo shoot. She promised the piece would be respectful and dignified. I did not know what to say. That Thursday, Linda came over with her usual offering, a lemon pound cake this time, and I showed her the email. Her eyes went wide as she read it, and when she looked up at me, there were tears forming at the edges. "Walter," she said, "this is wonderful. This is exactly what Rosalind would have wanted." I told her I was not sure, that I did not need attention, that I was just an old man teaching other old people to read. Linda set down her coffee cup and looked at me with the kind of seriousness she usually reserved for important matters. "Let the world see who you really are," she said. "Maybe Sophie will see it too. Maybe she will read this article and finally understand that her grandfather is not the villain they have made you out to be." I had not thought of it that way. The idea that Sophie might read about me, might see my photograph and realize I was still alive, still thinking of her, still hoping she might one day come back into my life. That hope, fragile and foolish as it was, made my decision for me. Before I agreed to anything, I called Raymond Clark. He was Rosalind's friend long before he was her lawyer, and I trusted his judgment more than my own. When I told him about the Time email, there was a pause on the line, a long one, longer than made sense for a simple question about legitimacy. I asked if everything was all right. Raymond cleared his throat and said, "Yes, absolutely. Time magazine is legitimate, and this sounds like a wonderful opportunity." But there was something in his voice, a strange lightness, almost like he was suppressing a smile. I asked him if he knew anything about this, if he had any idea who might have recommended me. Another pause. Then he said he was sure it was just someone from the community center who recognized good work when they saw it. He told me I should do it, that Rosalind would be proud. I thanked him and hung up, but the oddness of his reaction stayed with me. I agreed to the interview. Jennifer Walsh was kind and thorough, asking questions about Rosalind, about why I started the program, about what I hoped to accomplish. I answered honestly because I did not know how to be anything else. A photographer came to the community center and took pictures of me sitting with my students, helping a 78-year-old Vietnamese grandmother named Lynn write her name in English for the first time. It felt strange to be the subject rather than the teacher, but I reminded myself this was for Sophie. Everything was for Sophie. 1 week later, Walter Hammond's photograph appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Within hours, my phone would not stop ringing. The first call came from Marissa. I almost did not answer because I did not recognize the tone of her voice when she spoke my name. It was sweet, almost musical, dripping with a warmth I had never once heard from her in all the years she had been married to my son. "Dad," she said, stretching the word like taffy, "we are so incredibly proud of you." I held the phone away from my ear and stared at it, half convinced I had answered the wrong call. In 8 years, Marissa had never called me Dad. It was always Walter, spoken with the careful distance of someone addressing a stranger who happened to share a last name with her husband. She continued without waiting for me to respond. "The Time cover was absolutely wonderful," she said. "We had no idea you were doing such important work. Gavin and I were just saying this morning how we should have been more supportive." Her words tumbled out in a breathless rush, each one more enthusiastic than the last. I listened in silence, trying to locate the woman who had spent nearly a decade making sure I never spoke to my own son. I could not find her anywhere in this voice. Then came the invitation. "We simply must celebrate together," she said. "Dinner at our house tonight. Nothing fancy, just family. Sophie has been asking about you." That last sentence hit me like a punch to the chest. Sophie had been asking about me. Was it true? Had my granddaughter actually spoken my name, wondered where I was, asked why I never came around, or was Marissa simply saying what she thought I wanted to hear? I did not know anymore. I did not know what was real and what was performance. I told her I would think about it, and ended the call before she could say anything else. My hands were trembling. I set the phone on the kitchen table and stared at it like it might explode. Within minutes, it buzzed again. This time it was a text message from Gavin. I opened it and read 5 words that could not have been more different from his wife's gushing performance. "Dad, we should talk. Tonight." No exclamation points, no warmth, no mention of pride or celebration or Sophie asking about me. Just a cold, mechanical summons that read like something typed by a machine. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, looking at those 2 messages side by side in my mind. Marissa's voice echoing with artificial sweetness. Gavin's text stripped of any emotion whatsoever. The contrast was so stark it made my head hurt. These were supposed to be the same invitation, the same family reaching out after years of silence, but they did not match. Something was wrong. Something I could not quite name but could feel in my bones the way I feel rain coming before the first drop falls. That evening I decided to call Gavin directly. I needed to hear his voice, needed to understand what was really happening. He answered on the second ring, which surprised me. For 8 years, my calls had gone to voicemail more often than not. "Hello," he said, and I waited for him to continue. There was a pause, a rustling sound, and then he spoke again. "So you got our invitation. We would really like to see you tonight." His voice was flat, rehearsed, like he was reading from a card someone had placed in front of him. I asked him if everything was all right. Another pause, more rustling. Then I heard it, a whisper in the background, so faint I almost missed it, but unmistakable once I recognized the voice. "Marissa," she was saying something to him, her words just barely audible through the phone. "Tell him it is important. Tell him we are family." I held my breath and listened as Gavin repeated her words almost exactly. "This is really important to us, Dad. We are family after all." The realization settled over me slowly, like fog rolling in from the coast. My son was being coached. He was not calling me because he wanted to reconnect. He was calling because Marissa was standing beside him, feeding him lines, directing this little play she had written. I thought about all those years of silence, all those unanswered calls, all those times I was told Gavin was too busy to speak with me. Had she been controlling the script even then? Had every rejection been her words coming out of his mouth? I thought about the timing. For 8 years, I had been invisible to them. A ghost they pretended did not exist. Then my face appeared on the cover of Time magazine, and suddenly my phone would not stop ringing. Suddenly I was worth a dinner invitation. Suddenly Sophie was asking about me. The coincidence was too perfect, too convenient. They had not seen the article and felt a surge of family pride. They had seen the article and calculated that I might finally be worth something. What exactly they thought I was worth, I did not yet know, but I intended to find out. Gavin was still talking, filling the silence with words that meant nothing, when I interrupted him. I told him I would come. 3 words, spoken calmly, giving nothing away. I will be there. He sounded relieved, almost pathetically so, and said Marissa would be thrilled. I told him I would see him at 7 and ended the call. I stood in my kitchen as the evening light faded through the window, thinking about Rosalind. She always said I was too trusting, too willing to see the best in people even when they showed me their worst. She was right, of course. She was always right. But tonight would be different. Tonight I would walk into my son's house with my eyes wide open. I would smile and eat their food and listen to whatever performance they had prepared. And I would watch. Every glance, every word, every moment of hesitation. I would watch, and I would wait, and I would finally understand what my family truly wanted from me. This time, I would not be the fool. Marissa opened the door before I could knock, as if she had been watching from the window. She threw her arms around me with such force that I stumbled backward, and she held on far too long, swaying slightly like we were posing for a photograph no one was taking. "Oh, Dad," she breathed into my shoulder. "It is so wonderful to have you here." I stood rigid in her embrace, my arms hanging at my sides, unable to bring myself to return the gesture. This woman had kept me from my son for 8 years. Her sudden affection felt like a costume she had put on for the evening, and I could see the seams. She led me through the foyer and into the dining room, keeping one hand on my arm as if I might wander off without guidance. The room had been transformed into something from a magazine. Candles flickered in silver holders I had never seen before. Fresh flowers spilled from a crystal vase at the center of the table. The good china was out, the kind people only use when they want to impress someone. And there, at my place setting, stood a bottle of red wine with a ribbon tied around its neck. Marissa gestured toward it with a flourish. "Your favorite," she announced. "I remembered you loved this one." I looked at the label. It was a Merlot from some vineyard I had never heard of. Rosalind and I drank Pinot Noir exclusively for 40 years. Marissa had guessed wrong, and the error told me everything I needed to know about how much attention she had ever paid to who I actually was. Gavin sat at the far end of the table, already in his chair, staring at his empty plate like it contained something fascinating. When I entered the room, he glanced up for half a second before looking away again. "Hey, Dad," he mumbled. "Good to see you." The words had no weight to them, no substance. I pulled out my chair and sat down across from him, studying his face for some sign of the boy I had raised. He looked older than his 43 years, with shadows under his eyes and a tension in his jaw that never seemed to relax. I asked him how work was going. "Fine," he said. I asked about his health. "Fine," he said again. I tried once more, asking if he remembered the summer we spent restoring that old Ford pickup together, the summer before he left for college. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something like memory or regret. Then Marissa swept in with a platter of roasted chicken, and the moment vanished. During dinner, I mentioned Rosalind. It was a simple comment, something about how she would have loved the flower arrangement, how she always had a gift for making a table feel welcoming. The reaction was immediate. Gavin flinched like I had struck him. His fork clattered against his plate, and he reached for his wineglass with a hand that trembled slightly. Marissa jumped in before the silence could settle. She started talking about some renovation project they were planning for the kitchen, her voice bright and loud and relentlessly cheerful. I understood. Rosalind's name was not welcome in this house. They had erased her along with me. I was beginning to wonder why I had come at all when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Quick, eager footsteps that made my heart seize in my chest. And then there she was, Sophie, my granddaughter, 16 years old now, no longer the little girl I had watched from my car 2 years ago. She had grown into a young woman, but her eyes were exactly the same. Rosalind's eyes, that warm, searching brown that seemed to look right through pretense and into truth. She did not walk to me. She ran. She flew across the dining room and threw herself into my arms with a force that nearly knocked me from my chair. I caught her and held on, breathing in the smell of her shampoo, feeling the realness of her against my chest. She was crying. I could feel her tears soaking through my shirt, could feel her shoulders shaking with the effort of containing 8 years of separation in a single embrace. Then she leaned close to my ear and whispered something that stopped my heart. "I got your letters, Grandpa. All of them." I froze. My mind went blank. I had never sent any letters. I had wanted to. God knows I had wanted to, but I never knew her address, and I was too afraid of Marissa intercepting them and using them as evidence that I was harassing the family. I had written letters in my head 1,000 times, but never once put pen to paper. What was Sophie talking about? She squeezed my hand and glanced toward the window. Through the glass, I could see the yellow siding of Linda Bowen's house glowing in the evening light. Sophie whispered again, her lips barely moving. "She has been bringing them to me for 3 years. Linda, my neighbor, my Thursday coffee companion. She had been writing to Sophie on my behalf, pretending the letters were from me, keeping the connection alive when I thought it had been severed completely. 3 years of letters I never knew existed, building a bridge between me and my granddaughter while I sat in my kitchen believing I had been forgotten. I looked at Sophie with new eyes. She knew me. Not the stranger her parents had described, but the real me, the grandfather who loved her, who thought about her every day, who would have moved mountains to be part of her life. Linda had given her that. Linda had given us both something precious beyond measure. Before I could respond, Marissa's hand closed around Sophie's shoulder. "All right, sweetie," she said, her voice sharp beneath its sweetness. "Do not overwhelm your grandfather. He has had a long day." She pulled Sophie away from me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. Sophie went reluctantly, looking back at me with an expression that said, "We will talk later." I nodded once, just enough for her to see. Dessert was a store-bought pie that Marissa presented as homemade. I ate it without tasting it, my mind still reeling from Sophie's revelation. When the plates were cleared and the coffee poured, Marissa folded her hands on the table and fixed me with a look I had never seen before. It was hungry, calculating. The mask of warmth had slipped just enough for me to glimpse what lay beneath. "Now, Dad," she said, leaning forward slightly, "we have an important financial matter to discuss." Marissa's words hung in the air like smoke. Financial matter, I should have known. The elaborate dinner, the candles, the fake warmth, the wine she thought was my favorite, all of it had been leading to this moment. I folded my hands in my lap and waited for her to continue, keeping my face as neutral as I could manage. She explained that the Time magazine feature had generated significant public interest. People were talking about me, she said, about my charity work, about the inspiring story of an elderly widower dedicating his life to helping others. This kind of attention, she continued, leaning forward with gleaming eyes, creates opportunities. Sponsorship opportunities, partnership potential. She used phrases like family branding and managed growth and leveraged visibility, words that sounded like they came from a business seminar rather than a daughter-in-law speaking to her husband's father. The point, she said, was that money would be coming in, donations, perhaps, media payments. And since I was getting older and might find it difficult to manage such complexity, she and Gavin were offering to handle everything on my behalf. I looked at Gavin while she spoke. He was staring at the tablecloth, his jaw tight, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup so hard his knuckles had gone white. He did not look like a man making a generous offer. He looked like a man who wished he were anywhere else. I told Marissa I appreciated her concern, but there was nothing to manage. I had no money. My teacher's pension covered my modest needs. The literacy program operated on donated books and volunteer time. There were no sponsorships coming, no media payments, no sudden wealth. I was just an old man who had been put on a magazine cover for reasons I still did not fully understand. Marissa laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of someone who has been waiting to say something for a very long time. "We know, Dad," she said. "Trust me, we know." I checked years ago. The casualness of her confession stunned me. She continued without a trace of shame. After Rosalind passed, I looked into your finances. Thoroughly. I wanted to understand what we might be dealing with down the road. Inheritance, estate planning, that sort of thing. She waved her hand dismissively, but there was nothing. A small pension, a paid-off house that needed work, and no savings to speak of, so I figured there was no point in staying close. There it was, spoken aloud without apology. She had investigated me like a company considering an acquisition, found my value to be zero, and written me off. 8 years of silence explained in a single sentence. I was not worth the effort because I had nothing to offer. The dinner invitation stopped because I was a bad investment. My son stopped calling because his wife had done the math and decided I did not add up. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. I finished my coffee, thanked them for dinner, and asked Gavin to call me a cab. He drove me home himself, the first time he had been to my house in years. We did not speak during the ride. When he pulled into my driveway, he sat with his hands on the wheel for a long moment, then said he was sorry. I asked him what he was sorry for. He did not answer. I got out of the car and watched him drive away into the darkness. Inside, the house felt different, emptier somehow, though nothing had changed. I walked through the room slowly, touching Rosalind's things, trying to quiet the storm in my chest. Her jewelry box sat on the dresser where it had always been, a wooden chest with roses carved into the lid that I had given her for our 20th anniversary. I opened it without knowing why, just needing to feel close to her. Beneath her mother's pearls and the garnet earrings she wore on special occasions, I found something I had never seen before. A bank card. It was black with silver lettering, bearing the logo of a private wealth management firm I did not recognize. The name on the card was Rosalind Hammond. I turned it over in my hands, confused. On the back, in her familiar handwriting, were 4 words that made my breath catch. For Walter. When you are ready. She had hidden this. She had kept it secret even from me, tucked beneath her jewelry where she knew I would eventually find it. But why? What was this card? What had my wife been planning that she never told me about? The next morning, I showed the card to Linda. She studied it with the same confusion I felt, then offered to drive me to the bank. The address was in the city, a part of downtown I rarely visited, all glass towers and men in expensive suits. We found the building, and I went inside alone, clutching the card like a talisman. The teller was a young woman with a professional smile. I handed her the card and my identification. She typed something into her computer, glanced at the screen, then looked at me with an expression I could not read. Her eyes widened slightly. She asked me to wait and picked up the telephone on her desk. "Mr. Clark," she said into the receiver, her voice barely above a whisper. "He is here." Raymond Clark walked through the door 15 minutes later. I recognized him immediately, though he had aged since I last saw him at Rosalind's funeral. His hair had gone completely white, and he moved more slowly than I remembered, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, intelligent, and right now, filled with something that looked almost like relief. "Walter," he said, taking my hand in both of his. "I have been waiting for this day for 8 years." He led me away from the main floor and into a private room with leather chairs and a mahogany desk that gleamed under soft lighting. A woman brought us coffee in china cups, then closed the door behind her with a quiet click. Raymond sat across from me and folded his hands on the desk. He did not waste time with pleasantries. "Rosalind opened this account 15 years ago," he began. "She came to me with a small inheritance from her aunt, about $90,000. She said she did not want you to know about it, not because she was hiding anything from you, but because she was planning for a future she hoped would never come. She asked me to invest it quietly, conservatively, and to never speak of it unless something happened to her. I did exactly as she asked." He slid a folder across the desk. I opened it with trembling hands and saw numbers that made no sense. The account balance read $2,800,000. I looked at Raymond, certain there had been some mistake. He shook his head slowly. 15 years of careful investment," he said. "Your wife was not a wealthy woman, but she was a wise one. She knew how to let money grow." I could not speak. $2.8 million. Rosalind had built a fortune in secret, a safety net I never knew existed, and she had done it while making breakfast every morning and grading papers every night, and never once letting on that she was preparing for a day when she would no longer be there to protect me herself. Raymond reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope. I recognized the handwriting on the front immediately. My name, written in Rosalind's elegant script. The paper was slightly yellowed, the seal unbroken. He told me she had given it to him 1 month before she died, with instructions that I should receive it only when I found the account on my own. She wanted me to be ready, he said. She wanted you to discover this when you needed it most. I broke the seal with shaking fingers and unfolded the letter inside. Her handwriting filled the page, and for a moment I could hear her voice speaking the words aloud. "My dearest Walter," she wrote, "if you are reading this, I am gone, and you have finally found what I left behind. I want you to know that I saw everything. I watched Marissa for years, the way she calculated our worth, the way she looked at us like ledger entries instead of family. I saw how she pulled Gavin away from us, piece by piece, until he became a stranger in his own father's house. I could not stop it while I was alive. She was too clever, too patient, and Gavin was too weak to resist her. But I made sure you would never be left defenseless. Raymond will guide you. Trust him completely. He knows what I wanted, and he will help you protect yourself. And Walter, my love, I need you to hear this. Do not forgive too easily. Some people do not deserve it. They will come to you with sweet words and false tears when they learn what you have, and you must remember what they did when they thought you had nothing. Live well. That is the best revenge. Forever yours, Rosalind. I do not know how long I sat there with the letter in my hands. Time lost meaning. Tears ran down my face, and I did not bother to wipe them away. Even in death, my wife was protecting me. She had seen the danger I was too blind to recognize, and she had spent 15 years building a wall around me that Marissa could never breach. The weight of her love, her foresight, her fierce determination to keep me safe, pressed down on my chest until I could barely breathe. Raymond waited in silence until I collected myself. Then he explained the rest. The Time magazine feature was not an accident. Rosalind had written a letter years ago, addressed to the editorial board, telling them about my literacy program and asking them to consider featuring it someday. Raymond had held on to that letter, waiting for the right moment. When he saw that the program had grown, that I had built something meaningful from my grief, he sent it. He orchestrated the whole thing. She wanted the world to see you, he said quietly. And she wanted certain people to reveal themselves when they thought you had become valuable. I asked him what I should do now. He leaned back in his chair and considered the question carefully. Go home, he said. Say nothing about what you learned today. Let them come to you. Let them show you exactly who they are when they think they are close to getting what they want. The truth has a way of surfacing when greed is involved. That night, I was sitting in my kitchen, still holding Rosalind's letter, when my phone rang. Marissa's name glowed on the screen. I answered and heard her voice, sweet as honey but with something sharp beneath it. So Dad, she said, how was your trip to the bank? I told Marissa nothing on the phone. I said only that I had visited the bank to check on an old account of Rosalind's and that everything was fine. She pressed for details, her voice growing tighter with each question, but I remained vague. Finally, she demanded I come to their house the next evening for what she called a family meeting. The sweetness from the dinner party was completely gone. This was a summons, not an invitation. I agreed and hung up before she could say anything else. The next evening, I arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. Gavin opened the door but did not greet me. He simply stepped aside and gestured toward the living room like a butler showing a guest to their seat. Marissa was already waiting, positioned in an armchair that faced the sofa where I was clearly expected to sit. The arrangement reminded me of an interrogation room. She did not stand when I entered. She did not smile. The mask she had worn at dinner was nowhere to be seen. She began before I had even settled into my seat. I understand you visited a private bank yesterday, she said. Her voice was clipped, professional, stripped of any pretense of familial warmth. I would like to know exactly what accounts Rosalind maintained there and what the current balances are. She spoke as if she had a right to this information, as if my wife's private financial decisions were somehow her business to audit. I told her that Rosalind had set aside some savings and that the details were between me and my lawyer. Marissa's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward in her chair and folded her hands together. Dad, she said, pronouncing the word like it tasted sour, you are 70 years old. Managing significant assets at your age can be overwhelming, confusing. She paused to let the implications sink in. We think it would be best if you signed a power of attorney, just as a precaution. Families should handle family money. Gavin sat beside her on a matching armchair, nodding along with every word she spoke. His head bobbed up and down like a puppet on strings, but his eyes were fixed on the carpet. He would not look at me. He had not looked at me since I walked through the door. I told them no. The word came out calm and clear, surprising even me with its steadiness. I said I appreciated their concern, but I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. Raymond Clark had been Rosalind's lawyer for decades, and I trusted him completely. There was no need for anyone else to be involved. Marissa's composure cracked. Her jaw tightened and her voice rose half an octave. You could get confused, she insisted. You could make mistakes, sign something you do not understand, get taken advantage of by strangers. We are trying to help you. She spat the last sentence like an accusation, as if my refusal to hand over control of my finances was somehow an act of aggression against her. I remained seated, watching her perform outrage while Gavin continued to stare at nothing. I thought about Rosalind's letter. Do not forgive too easily. Some people do not deserve it. My wife had seen this woman clearly when I was still blind. She had known exactly what Marissa would do when she smelled money, and she had been right about everything. A small sound came from the doorway. I turned and saw Sophie standing there, her face wet with tears. She had been listening. I did not know for how long, but the devastation in her expression told me she had heard enough. Her voice trembled when she spoke. Why are you talking to Grandpa like he is a problem? She looked at her mother with something close to disgust. He is not sick. He is not confused. Why are you treating him like this? Marissa's head snapped toward her daughter. Go to your room, she commanded. This is an adult conversation. Sophie did not move. She stood in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself, crying silently, refusing to leave. Marissa raised her voice. Now, Sophie. I said go to your room. Gavin said nothing. He did not defend his daughter. He did not even look up. I rose from the sofa. The movement was slow, deliberate, giving me time to look at each of them in turn. Marissa glared at me with barely contained fury. Sophie watched me with desperate, hopeful eyes, and Gavin, finally, lifted his gaze from the floor. What I saw in his face was not anger. It was not defiance. It was shame, pure, crushing shame. His lips moved, forming words so quiet I almost missed them. I tried, Dad. I tried. He did not explain what he meant. He did not say what he had tried to do or when or why it had failed, but something in his voice told me there was more to the story than I knew. I walked to the front door with Marissa's voice rising behind me, demanding that I stop, that I listen, that I understand what I was throwing away. I paused with my hand on the doorknob and turned back to face her one final time. You will hear from my lawyer soon, I said. Behind me, as I stepped into the cool night air, Marissa's scream echoed through the house. You cannot do this to us. I called Raymond first thing the next morning. My hands were still shaking from the confrontation at Gavin's house, but my mind had never been clearer. Whatever game Marissa was playing, I needed to be prepared. Raymond agreed to meet me at his office within the hour. His office was small but comfortable, lined with bookshelves and framed photographs of clients whose lives he had helped protect over the decades. I noticed a picture of Rosalind on his desk, taken at some charity event years ago. She was laughing at something outside the frame, her head tilted back, utterly alive. Seeing her face in that moment nearly undid me, but I steadied myself and took the seat across from Raymond. We spent the first hour on practical matters. Raymond walked me through the security measures he had already implemented on the accounts. New passwords had been created. Access was restricted to me alone, with Raymond listed as the secondary contact in case of emergency. No one else could inquire about balances, request transfers, or make any changes without my explicit written authorization and 2 forms of identification. Marissa could call that bank every day for the rest of her life and learn nothing. Then we turned to the question of my estate. Raymond had prepared a preliminary draft of a new will, one that would replace the outdated document I had signed years ago when Gavin was still a young man and Marissa was just a name I barely knew. The new will would establish a charitable foundation in Rosalind's name, funded by the bulk of my assets. We discussed provisions for Sophie. protections to ensure Marissa could never touch anything intended for my granddaughter. Raymond took careful notes, promising to have a formal document ready within the week. When the business was concluded, Raymond leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. "There is something else you should know," he said. "Something I have not told you yet." I waited, sensing that whatever came next would change my understanding of everything. "Rosalind asked me to send your story to Time magazine," he said. "She wrote a letter to their editorial board years ago, describing your character, your dedication, your quiet work helping others. She asked me to hold on to it and deliver it when I judged the moment was right. She said publicity would force the truth into daylight. She said it would make certain people reveal themselves." I sat in stunned silence. The Time feature had not been luck or coincidence. It had been Rosalind. Even from beyond the grave, my wife had been orchestrating events, moving pieces on a board I could not see. She had known that attention would bring Marissa running. She had known that greed would strip away the pretense of family loyalty. She had planned for this moment years before it arrived, Raymond continued. "She told me to watch for signs that you were ready. When I saw what you had built with the literacy program, when I saw how you had turned your grief into something meaningful, I knew it was time. I sent the letter. Time responded within weeks." He paused. "Your wife was an extraordinary woman, Walter. She did not just leave you money. She left you a complete strategy." I thought about Rosalind sitting at her desk, writing that letter, imagining a future where she would no longer be alive to protect me herself. The depth of her love, the precision of her planning, overwhelmed me. She had seen everything. She had prepared for everything, and she had trusted Raymond to carry out her wishes when the time came. "There is one more thing," Raymond added. His voice grew careful, measured. "Rosalind made another arrangement, something separate, but I cannot tell you about it yet. You will understand when the time is right." I wanted to press him, to demand answers, but something in his expression told me this was not negotiable. Rosalind had set the timeline, and Raymond would honor it. Before I left, I asked Raymond about recording conversations. Marissa would certainly come at me again, and I wanted evidence of whatever she tried next. Raymond explained that our state allowed recordings as long as one party consented, which meant I could legally record any conversation I was part of without informing the other participants. He recommended a simple app for my phone and showed me how to use it. "Document everything," he said. "Let them dig their own grave." That night, I sat alone in my living room with the lights dimmed and Rosalind's photograph in my hands. I looked at her face for a long time, seeing her differently now, not just as the woman I had loved and lost, but as the architect of my protection. "You knew all along," I whispered to her image. "You saw what they would become, and you prepared for it. You were always the smart one." I placed the photograph back on the mantel and went to bed, my phone charging on the nightstand with the recording app ready. I did not know when Marissa would make her next move, but I knew it would come soon. Greed does not wait patiently. The next morning, I was making coffee when I heard tires on gravel. I looked through the kitchen window and saw Marissa's silver sedan pulling into my driveway. She stepped out of the car holding a manila folder with words printed on the front in bold letters, "Family Financial Plan." Her face was set in determination, her heels clicking against the pavement as she marched toward my door. I picked up my phone, opened the app, and pressed record. I opened the door before she could knock. Marissa stood on my porch with the folder clutched against her chest, her smile tight and determined. Behind her, climbing out of the passenger seat with the slow movements of a man who had not slept in days, was Gavin. His face was pale, his shoulders slumped, his eyes ringed with dark circles. He looked like someone being marched to his own execution. Marissa did not wait for an invitation. She brushed past me into the house and headed straight for the kitchen table, spreading her documents across its surface before I had even closed the front door. She had come prepared. The folder contained a thick stack of papers covered in legal language, charts, and signature lines marked with small adhesive flags. At the top of the first page, printed in elegant letterhead, were the words, "Hammond Family Trust." Marissa arranged the documents with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this presentation many times. Gavin lingered near the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the floor. Marissa launched into her pitch without preamble. She explained that she and Gavin had been thinking about my well-being, about the challenges that come with managing significant assets at my age. "This trust," she said, Tapping the papers with a manicured fingernail protects you. If anything happens, health issues, memory problems, anything at all, we will be able to step in and manage everything on your behalf. You will not have to worry about a thing. I sat down at the table and pulled the documents toward me, pretending to study them carefully. The language was dense, filled with terms like fiduciary responsibility and asset consolidation and discretionary distribution authority. But buried in the fine print, I found what I was looking for. The trust would name Marissa and Gavin as co-trustees with full authority to move funds, make investments, and authorize expenditures without my approval. I would retain the title of beneficiary, but in practice I would have no control over anything. I would become a figurehead, a name on paper, while Marissa held all the real power. What struck me most was the date at the bottom of the first page. The document had been drafted 3 months ago, long before the Time magazine article, long before Marissa knew anything about Rosalind's accounts. She had been planning this for months, perhaps years, waiting for the right moment to spring the trap. The article had simply accelerated her timeline. I looked up from the papers and asked a question I already knew the answer to. So, you would take care of everything? My voice was deliberately naive, the voice of a confused old man who needed guidance. Maris's eyes lit up. She leaned forward eagerly, sensing victory. Exactly, she said. You just sign here, and here, and here. She pointed to each flagged line in turn, and we handle the rest. All the complicated stuff, the taxes, the investments, the legal requirements. You will not have to think about money ever again. You can just relax and enjoy your retirement knowing your family is looking out for you. I nodded slowly, as if considering her generous offer. My phone sat in my shirt pocket, recording every word. I thought about how this would sound to a judge, to a jury, to anyone who heard a daughter-in-law explaining to a 70-year-old man that he should sign away control of his life savings so he would not have to think anymore. I glanced at Gavin. He was still standing near the doorway, still staring at the floor, but now his eyes kept darting toward the front entrance. He looked like a trapped animal searching for an escape route. When I caught his gaze directly, he flinched and looked away. He had not said a single word since entering my house. Whatever fight he might once have had, Marissa had extinguished it long ago. She pushed a pen across the table toward me. Her smile was radiant, confident, the smile of someone who believed she had already won. "Just your signature, Dad," she said. "That is all we need to make this official. We are doing this for you, for the family." I picked up the pen. I held it over the first signature line, watching Marissa's body tense with anticipation. Gavin finally looked up, his expression unreadable. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a bird singing outside the window. Then I set the pen down, unsigned. Marissa's smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out my phone. "Before I decide anything," I said calmly, "I think you should hear something." I watched the color drain from her face as I unlocked the screen and navigated to the recording I had made at their house, the night she had demanded I sign the power of attorney. The night she had revealed exactly what she thought of me. I pressed play. Marissa's eyes locked onto the phone in my hand, wide with sudden fear. But I did not press play. Not yet. I wanted her to understand something first. I wanted her to see exactly how thoroughly her scheme had failed before I showed her the evidence of her own words. I set the phone face down on the table and reached into the folder I had placed on the kitchen counter earlier that morning. I had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it ever since my meeting with Raymond. The document I withdrew was crisp and official, bearing the raised seal of a notary public and the signatures of 2 witnesses. I placed it on the table in front of Marissa, directly on top of her carefully arranged trust papers. "Before we discuss anything else," I said, "I think you should see this." Marissa stared at the document, like it was a snake coiled on her kitchen table. Her eyes scanned the header, and I watched the color begin to drain from her face. Last will and testament of Walter James Hammond. The date in the corner was 1 week ago. She looked up at me, then back at the paper, her mouth opening and closing without sound. I picked up the will and began to read aloud. The language was formal, prepared by Raymond with meticulous care, but the meaning was clear. "I, Walter James Hammond, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and testaments, and declare this to be my final wishes regarding the disposition of my estate. I paused to let the words settle, then continued. All assets in my possession at the time of my death, including but not limited to financial accounts, investments, and real property, shall be transferred to the Rosalind Hammond Foundation, a charitable trust established for the purpose of funding educational programs for underserved communities. Marissa's hand shot out and grabbed the edge of the document, trying to pull it toward her. I held firm and kept reading. The house located at 247 Maple Street, currently my primary residence, shall be donated to the foundation to serve as its operational headquarters, or to be sold, with proceeds directed toward the foundation's mission. My granddaughter, Sophie Marie Hammond, is named as the sole family beneficiary of a separate trust, to be released to her in full upon her 25th birthday, the details of which are maintained separately by my attorney Raymond Clark. I set the document down and looked directly at Marissa. Her face was cycling through emotions so rapidly I could barely track them. Shock gave way to disbelief, then to a rage so intense her hands began to tremble. Finally, something like desperation crept into her eyes. The look of someone watching a fortune slip through her fingers. "You cannot do this," she hissed. Her voice was barely controlled, vibrating with fury. "That money belongs to this family. It belongs to Gavin. It belongs to us. We are your heirs. That is how inheritance works. You cannot just give everything to some charity and cut out your own son." I let her finish. I let her words hang in the air, revealing exactly what she cared about. Not my well-being, not family connection, not love or loyalty or any of the things she had pretended to value. Just the money, just the inheritance she had been counting on since the day she married my son. Family, I repeated the word slowly, tasting its bitterness. Family does not abandon family for 8 years. Family does not calculate worth before deciding whether someone deserves their time. Family does not investigate an old man's finances and then throw him away because he has nothing to offer. I kept my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. This is exactly what Rosalind wanted. She saw what you were long before I did. She made sure I would be protected. Marissa lunged forward, slamming her palms on the table. "This is insane. You are not competent to make these decisions. We will challenge this in court. We will have you declared mentally unfit. No judge will let a senile old man give away millions of dollars to strangers when he has living family members who deserve that money." The word senile cut deep, but I did not flinch. I had been called worse things in my own head during the long years of silence. I had wondered myself if something was wrong with me, if I had done something to deserve being cast aside. Now I knew the truth. The only thing wrong with me was that I had believed their excuses for far too long. A sound came from near the doorway. Gavin. He had been standing there motionless throughout my reading, his face ashen, his body rigid. But now his voice emerged, cracked and broken, barely louder than a whisper. "Dad, please." His eyes were wet. His hands were shaking. "You do not understand what He stopped abruptly. Marissa's head whipped toward him. The look she gave him was not just anger. It was a warning, a threat. Whatever Gavin had been about to say died in his throat. He closed his mouth and looked away, retreating back into the silence that had swallowed him whole. I watched my son in that moment and felt something I had not expected. Not anger, not satisfaction, pity. He was trapped, just as surely as I had been trapped in my lonely house for 8 years. Whatever hold Marissa had over him, it was strong enough to silence him even now, even when everything was falling apart. But pity would not change what needed to happen next. I picked up my phone from the table and held it up so both of them could see the screen. The recording app was still open, the playback ready. "Now," I said quietly, "let me play you something from our last meeting." I pressed play. The recording filled my small kitchen with voices that seemed to belong to strangers, though I knew them intimately. First came Marissa's pitch from just minutes earlier, her tone dripping with false concern as she explained how the family trust would protect me. But then the recording continued, pulling in fragments from our previous meetings that I had captured without their knowledge. Her voice shifted, becoming sharper, more impatient. "We need to secure these assets before the old man does something stupid. He is clearly not thinking clearly." Once we have the power of attorney, we can move everything into accounts we control. He will never even know the difference." Marissa's face went white. She grabbed for my phone, but I pulled it back, holding it just out of reach. The recording was not finished. Gavin's voice came next. I had captured it during the family meeting at their house, in a moment when he thought I had stepped away to use the restroom. His words were quiet but perfectly clear. "Just get him to sign the papers. He will not live much longer anyway. Once he is gone, we can sort out the rest. The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can stop pretending we care about his little charity project." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched Marissa's expression shift from panic to calculation, already searching for a way to spin this, to explain it away. But Gavin looked like a man who had just watched his own soul laid bare. His mouth hung open. No words came. Then a small voice broke the silence, a voice that should not have been there. "Dad, how could you say that?" We all turned toward the kitchen doorway. Sophie stood there in her pajamas, her hair tangled from sleep, her face streaked with tears. She must have heard the commotion and crept downstairs to listen. Now she stared at her father with an expression I will never forget. It was not anger. It was something worse. It was the look of a child realizing that the person she loved was not who she believed him to be. Gavin took a step toward her. "Sophie, honey, I can explain. That was taken out of context. I did not mean—" Sophie shook her head, cutting him off. "I heard you, Dad. I heard exactly what you said." She wrapped her arms around herself, shrinking away from him. "You said Grandpa would not live much longer. You said you were pretending to care. I wanted to go to her, to hold her, to tell her that none of this was her fault. But there was more she needed to hear. The truth had been buried for too long, and it was time to dig up all of it." I pulled a second document from my folder. This one had arrived from Raymond just yesterday, the result of weeks of investigation. I held it up so everyone could see the header. "Phone records," I said. "From my cellular carrier, Raymond submitted a legal request to recover deleted messages from my account. Messages I never saw, messages someone erased before I could read them." Gavin's face went gray. Marissa's eyes darted between me and the document, calculating, always calculating. I read aloud from the first recovered message, dated 5 years ago. "Dad, I'm sorry. Marissa says you do not want to see us anymore. Is that true? I miss you. Please call me." I looked up at my son. "You sent this to me, Gavin. You sent 12 messages over the course of 6 months. I never received a single one." The room seemed to tilt. Gavin's hands came up to cover his face, his shoulders beginning to shake. "I did not understand. I thought you were ignoring me. She told me you said you never wanted to hear from us again. She said you blamed me for Mom's death." I remembered then. 7 years ago, a few months after Rosalind's funeral, Marissa had come to my house alone. She said she wanted to help me clean up, to sort through Rosalind's things. I had been so grateful for the gesture, so desperate for any connection to my son's family, that I left her alone in the house while I went to the pharmacy. She must have found my phone. She must have deleted Gavin's messages and then fed him lies about my supposed hatred. I looked at Marissa. Her mask had finally cracked completely. Beneath it was something cold and calculating, an animal caught in a trap of her own making. "You came to my house," I said slowly. "You told me you wanted to help, and you used that visit to destroy the last connection between me and my son." Gavin lifted his face from his hands. He was crying openly now, tears streaming down his cheeks like a child's. "I thought you hated me," he whispered. "All these years. I thought you never wanted to see me again." I believed her. I believed everything she said. The weight of 7 wasted years pressed down on both of us. 7 years of silence that could have been filled with phone calls, with visits, with the slow repair of a relationship strained by grief. All of it stolen by a woman who saw family as nothing more than a transaction. A movement near the doorway caught my attention. Sophie had straightened up, her tears still falling, but her expression changed. There was something fierce in her eyes now, something determined. She reached into the pocket of her pajamas and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age, creased from being folded and unfolded countless times. "There is something else you all need to know," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Grandma wrote to me too." Sophie walked slowly into the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the tile floor. Every eye in the room followed her as she moved to stand beside me, positioning herself between her grandfather and the parents who had kept us apart. In her hands, she held the small envelope I had glimpsed moments before, but now I noticed something else. Around her neck hung a delicate silver chain, and from it dangled a small oval locket I recognized instantly. Rosalind had worn that locket every day of her adult life. She must have given it to Sophie before she died. Sophie's fingers trembled as she opened the locket's tiny clasp. Inside, folded into an impossibly small square, was a piece of paper so worn it looked like it might disintegrate at the slightest touch. She unfolded it with the careful reverence of someone handling a sacred artifact. The paper was yellowed, the creases deep and soft from years of being opened and read and folded again. "I have kept this since I was 8 years old," Sophie said. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Grandma gave it to me the last time I saw her. She made me promise to keep it secret until I was old enough to understand." She looked down at the letter in her hands, and when she spoke again, her voice cracked with emotion. She read aloud, and Rosalind's words filled the room like a ghost returning to deliver one final message. "My dearest Sophie, you are too young to understand now, but one day you will. Your grandfather is the best man I have ever known. He is kind and patient and full of love, and there are people who will try to keep him from you. Do not let them. When you are old enough, find him, protect each other. You have my strength in you, more than you know. I love you forever. Grandma." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Rosalind had known. Even as she lay dying, even as cancer stole her strength day by day, she had seen what was coming. She had looked at her daughter-in-law and understood exactly what kind of person Marissa was. She had looked at her son and seen his weakness, his inability to stand against his wife, and she had placed her faith not in them, but in a child. An 8-year-old girl who would one day grow into someone strong enough to bridge the distance that greed and manipulation would create. Sophie carefully refolded the letter and placed it back inside the locket. Then she turned to face her parents. Her tears had dried. Her chin was raised. In that moment, she looked so much like Rosalind that my breath caught in my throat. "Grandma knew," Sophie said. Her voice was cold in a way I had never heard from her before. "She knew what you would become. She saw it happening even before she died. That is why she wrote this letter. That is why she made me promise to find Grandpa when I was old enough." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I have been writing to Grandpa for 3 years because of this letter. Linda helped me. We found a way to stay connected even though you tried to erase him from my life. Because Grandma told me to protect him, and I did." Marissa's composure shattered completely. Her face contorted with rage, and she took a step towards Sophie, her hand raised as if to strike. "You ungrateful little traitor," she screamed. "We are your parents. We raised you. We gave you everything. And you have been sneaking around behind our backs, conspiring with that old man against your own family?" Sophie did not flinch. She did not step back. She met her mother's fury with a calm that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, some reservoir of strength that Rosalind had promised was there. "No," Sophie said. Her voice was quiet but absolute. "You betrayed Grandpa. You cut him out of our lives because he had nothing you wanted. You deleted Dad's messages so they would hate each other. You lied to everyone for years. And Dad." She turned to look at Gavin, and something in her expression shifted from anger to grief. "Dad let you. He knew something was wrong. He must have known. But he never fought for Grandpa. He never fought for me. He just let you control everything." Gavin made a sound I had never heard from him before. It was not a word, not quite a sob. It was the sound of something breaking inside a person, the collapse of every wall they had built to protect themselves from the truth. He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his body folding in on itself, and he began to cry. Not the performative tears of manipulation. These were the desperate, ugly tears of a man who had just realized he had lost everything that mattered. His daughter stood before him with eyes full of contempt, and he knew he deserved every ounce of it. Sophie watched her father cry for a long moment. I could see her fighting with herself, part of her wanting to comfort him, the daughter who still loved her dad despite everything. But she stayed where she was. Some wounds are too deep for easy forgiveness. Rosalind had known that too. A knock at the front door broke the terrible silence. I had forgotten that Raymond was coming. I had asked him to join us after I revealed the will, knowing that more would need to be explained, more arrangements discussed. I went to let him in, and he entered the kitchen with the quiet dignity of a man who had witnessed many family dramas over his long career. He took in the scene with a single glance. Marissa frozen in rage. Gavin collapsed in grief. Sophie standing tall beside me, Rosalind's locket gleaming at her throat. Raymond cleared his throat softly. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. "But there is one final matter that Rosalind arranged." He looked directly at Sophie, and something in his expression softened. "This one, my dear, is about you." Raymond's revelation about Sophie would wait for a quieter moment. In the chaos that followed his announcement, Marissa stormed out of my house with Gavin trailing behind her like a shadow. Sophie stayed with me that night, sleeping in the guest room I had not used in years, and in the morning, Linda drove her back to her parents' house. I watched them pull away and wondered if I would ever see my granddaughter again, or if Marissa would find some way to punish her for choosing my side. The days that followed were strangely quiet. I went through my routines mechanically, teaching my literacy classes, sharing Thursday coffee with Linda, talking to Rosalind's photograph each morning. But underneath the calm, I could feel something building. Marissa was not the type to accept defeat gracefully. She would find another way to get what she wanted. I just did not know when or how. The call came 5 days after the confrontation. I was washing my breakfast dishes when my phone rang, displaying an unfamiliar number with the area code of the city where my bank was located. A woman's voice, professional and cautious, identified herself as the head of account security. She asked if I was Walter Hammond and if I had recently authorized anyone to act on my behalf regarding my financial accounts. I told her I had not. She paused for a moment, and I heard her typing something before she continued. "Earlier this morning," she explained, "a woman came to our main branch claiming to be your caretaker. She presented a power of attorney document that supposedly gave her authority to access and manage your accounts. The document bore your signature." I felt my stomach drop. The security officer continued, "However, our records show that you visited this branch in person just 2 weeks ago. You were clearly competent and made no mention of any caretaker or authorized representative. When we compared the signature on the POA to your signature on file, they did not match. We declined the transaction and have reported the incident to the appropriate authorities." I thanked her and ended the call with shaking hands. Marissa had forged my signature. She had created a fake legal document and walked into my bank, bold as daylight, believing she could simply take what she wanted. The audacity of it stunned me, though perhaps it should not have. A woman willing to delete messages between a father and son, willing to isolate an old man for 8 years, willing to manipulate her own daughter, would certainly not hesitate at forgery. The second call came an hour later. This time it was a detective from the city police department. He introduced himself and asked if he could verify some details about the incident at the bank. I confirmed everything the security officer had told me, and he explained the situation in stark terms. The woman who attempted to access my accounts had been identified as Marissa Hammond. She was now under investigation for attempted elder financial abuse and forgery, both of which were felonies in our state. Depending on the evidence, she could face significant prison time. I called Raymond immediately after hanging up with the detective. He listened to my account of both conversations, then explained the legal landscape I was now navigating. Even if I chose not to press charges personally, the state could still prosecute Marissa based on the bank's report and the detective's investigation. However, Raymond advised that I could also pursue a civil restraining order, which would legally prohibit Marissa from contacting me or coming within a certain distance of my home. Given her pattern of behavior, he believed any judge would grant it immediately. There was another consequence Raymond mentioned, one that seemed almost poetic in its justice. Marissa worked in real estate. Her career depended on her reputation, on clients trusting her with the largest financial transactions of their lives. When this investigation became public record, and it would become public record, that trust would evaporate. No one wants to buy a house through an agent who forged documents to steal from her elderly father-in-law. Her professional life was effectively over. I sat with that knowledge for a long time after Raymond and I finished speaking. I did not feel the satisfaction I expected. There was no joy in watching someone's life crumble, even someone who had caused me so much pain. I felt only a deep, heavy sadness for the waste of it all. The wasted years, the wasted relationships, the family that could have been, destroyed by one person's greed. Late that evening, my phone rang again. This time, the name on the screen was Gavin. I stared at it for 3 rings before answering, bracing myself for another confrontation, another attempt at manipulation. But the voice that greeted me was not the cold, rehearsed voice of a puppet. It was the broken voice of a man who had finally seen the truth. Gavin was sobbing so hard I could barely understand him. Between gasps, he told me he had known nothing about the forgery. Marissa had done it without telling him, convinced that she could fix everything if she just got access to the accounts. When the police showed up at their door that afternoon, he learned what she had done at the same moment they did. He kept saying he was sorry, over and over, the words tumbling out in a flood of grief and shame. He said he knew he did not deserve forgiveness. He knew he had failed me for years, but he was begging, literally begging, for one chance to explain himself, one chance to apologize face to face. I listened to my son cry and remembered the little boy who used to climb into my lap and ask me to read him stories. That boy was still in there somewhere, buried under years of manipulation and cowardice. I did not know if I could forgive him. I did not know if I even wanted to. But I knew I needed to hear what he had to say. I agreed to one final meeting, but on my terms. "Come alone, Gavin," I said. "Without her, if you can." Raymond arrived at my house the next morning, earlier than I expected. I had assumed he was coming to discuss the restraining order paperwork or perhaps to update me on the investigation into Marissa's forgery. But the expression on his face when I opened the door told me this visit was about something else entirely. He carried a slim leather briefcase that I had seen before, the same one he brought to the bank the day I discovered Rosalind's accounts. There was more to reveal. Sophie was already there. She had come over after school the previous day and simply never left. Marissa, facing criminal charges and the collapse of her marriage, had not objected when Sophie packed a bag and walked out. I suspected Marissa had larger concerns at the moment than her daughter's whereabouts. Sophie sat at my kitchen table now, nursing a cup of hot chocolate, looking more peaceful than I had seen her in weeks. When Raymond entered, she straightened in her chair, sensing the weight of whatever he had come to say. Raymond settled into the seat across from Sophie and opened his briefcase. From it, he withdrew a folder I had not seen before, thinner than the others, marked with Sophie's full name in Rosalind's handwriting. He placed it on the table between us and folded his hand. "There is one final arrangement your grandmother made," he said, addressing Sophie directly. "She asked me to wait until the right moment to tell you about it. I believe that moment has come." He opened the folder and began to explain. 16 years ago, on the day Sophie was born, Rosalind had visited Raymond's office with a request. She wanted to establish a separate trust account in her newborn granddaughter's name, not connected to any other assets, not accessible by anyone except Sophie herself, an irrevocable trust, locked away where no one could touch it, no matter what happened to the rest of the family's finances. Sophie leaned forward, her eyes wide. "I do not understand," she said. "Grandma set up an account for me when I was a baby?" Raymond nodded. "She funded it every year on your birthday. For 8 years, until she passed away, she deposited money into this account. She told me that if Marissa ruined everything else, at least Sophie would be free." Those were her exact words. He slid a document across the table, showing the account balance. $400,000. Sophie would gain full access on her 18th birthday, less than 2 years away. The number hung in the air like something impossible. Sophie stared at the paper, her lips moving slightly as if she were trying to convince herself it was real. $400,000. Enough to pay for college, enough to start a life of her own, enough to walk away from anyone who tried to control her. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Grandma did this for me," she whispered. "Before I could even walk, before she knew who I would become, she loved me that much." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Your grandmother saw you clearly from the moment you were born," I said. "She knew exactly who you would become because she saw herself in you. Strong, brave, unwilling to be controlled by anyone. She wanted to make sure you would always have options, no matter what happened." Raymond gathered the documents and placed them back in the folder. "The trust is ironclad," he said. "Your mother has no legal claim to any of it. She cannot access it, cannot redirect it, cannot even see the balance. When you turn 18, the money becomes yours completely. You can use it however you wish." Sophie was crying openly now, clutching the folder to her chest like a lifeline. "All those years," she said through her tears, "I thought I was trapped. I thought I would never get away from her. I thought I would have to depend on them forever. And the whole time, Grandma had already set me free." I moved around the table and wrapped my arms around my granddaughter. She buried her face in my shoulder and sobbed, 8 years of grief and fear and hope pouring out of her. I held her and thought about Rosalind, about the depth of her love and the precision of her planning. She had protected me with her hidden accounts. She had connected me to Sophie through her secret letters, and she had given Sophie the ultimate gift: independence, the ability to walk away from anyone who mistreated her forever. When Sophie's tears finally subsided, she pulled back and looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "Grandpa," she said, her voice small but determined, "can I live with you until I go to college? I do not want to go back to that house. I do not want to be around her anymore." I did not hesitate. "Of course you can," I said. "This is your home for as long as you want it. We will figure out the legal details later. Raymond can help us with that. But you belong here, Sophie. You have always belonged here." She hugged me again, tighter this time, and I felt something shift in the universe. For 8 years, I had lived in this house alone, surrounded by Rosalind's belongings, talking to her photograph each morning because there was no one else to talk to. Now my granddaughter was here, and the silence that had pressed down on me for so long began to lift. Rosalind had given me this too. She had known that Sophie would find her way back to me, and she had made sure that when she did, she would be able to stay. Raymond excused himself quietly, leaving the folder on the table for Sophie to review later. I walked him to the door and thanked him for everything he had done, for all the years he had kept Rosalind's secrets safe until they were needed. He shook my hand and told me that Rosalind had been the best friend he ever had. Protecting her family, he said, had been the greatest honor of his career. I was just returning to the kitchen when the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Gavin standing alone on my porch. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, shrunken somehow, as if the weight of everything that had happened had compressed him into a diminished version of himself. His eyes were red, his hands were shaking. He did not try to come inside. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have something to tell you about what Marissa made me hide." I stepped aside and let Gavin enter. He walked past me slowly, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the floor. Sophie had retreated to the guest room when she heard the doorbell, giving us privacy for whatever was about to unfold. I led Gavin to the kitchen table, the same table where Marissa had spread her fraudulent trust documents just days before. He sat down heavily, as if his legs could no longer support his weight, and placed his trembling hands flat on the wooden surface. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I watched my son struggle to find words, his mouth opening and closing, his eyes glistening with tears he was fighting to contain. I did not prompt him. I did not make this easier. He had come here to confess, and I would let him do it on his own terms. Finally, he began. "She told me you blamed us for Mom's death," he said, his voice cracking on the first sentence, "right after the funeral. She said you had told her privately that you could not stand to look at me because I reminded you too much of her. She said you needed space, maybe years of space, and that I should respect your grief by staying away." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Rosalind had died of cancer. There was no one to blame. The disease had taken her despite every treatment, every prayer, every desperate hope. The idea that I would blame my own son for her death was so absurd, so cruel, that I could barely process it. Gavin continued, the words pouring out now like water through a broken dam. "Every time I tried to call you, she intercepted it. She would answer your phone when you were not looking, or she would check your voicemails and delete them before you heard them. She told me you never responded because you did not want to. She said you had made your feelings clear, and I needed to accept that my father was gone, just like my mother." He looked up at me then, his face contorted with anguish. "I knew something was wrong, Dad. Deep down, I knew it did not make sense. You were never that kind of man. You never held grudges. You never turned your back on family. But she was so convincing. She had an answer for every doubt. And when I said I wanted to drive over and see you myself, she threatened me." I leaned forward slightly. "Threatened you how?" Gavin's hands curled into fists on the table. "She said if I contacted you against her wishes, she would take Sophie and leave. She would file for divorce and make sure I never saw my daughter again. She said she had documented everything, that she could prove I was an unfit father, that no court would give me custody. He shook his head, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. I was a coward. I know that. I should have called her bluff. I should have fought for you. But Sophie was just a little girl, and I could not bear the thought of losing her, so I stayed silent. I let Marissa control everything because I was too afraid to stand up to her. The confession hung in the air between us, heavy with years of wasted time. I thought about all the phone calls I had made, all the voicemails I had left, all the times I had been told that Gavin was too busy or did not want to talk. Marissa had built a wall between us, brick by brick, lie by lie, until we were strangers living 40 minutes apart. "There is more," Gavin said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "A few months ago, Marissa found something in a box of Mom's old paperwork, a letter addressed to you in Mom's handwriting. She never showed it to me, but she panicked after she read it. She started pushing harder for the power of attorney, for control of your finances. She said we needed to secure everything before you did something reckless. I did not understand why she was so urgent until I heard you read Mom's letter out loud in this kitchen." So Marissa had known. She had discovered Rosalind's warning and understood that her schemes were in danger of being exposed. That explained the sudden dinner invitation, the aggressive push for legal control, the desperation that had driven her to forge my signature. She had been racing against a clock I did not even know was ticking. Gavin fell silent, his confession complete. He sat before me like a man awaiting sentencing, his fate entirely in my hands. I could send him away forever. I could tell him that his cowardice had cost us 8 years that we would never get back, that some betrayals are too deep to forgive. Part of me wanted to say exactly that, but another part of me looked at my son and saw the little boy who used to fall asleep in my arms while I read him stories about brave knights and noble quests. That boy had grown into a man who made terrible choices, but he had made them out of fear, not malice. He had been manipulated by someone far more ruthless than he could handle. It did not excuse what he had done, but it helped me understand it. "If I forgive you," I said slowly, "what happens next?" Gavin looked up, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. "I have already filed for divorce," he said. "I am moving into a small apartment next week. I do not want anything from you, Dad. Not money, not inheritance, nothing. I just want a chance to be your son again, on your terms. However long it takes, I will earn your trust back if you let me try." I considered his words carefully. Rosalind's voice echoed in my mind. Do not forgive too easily. Some people do not deserve it. But she had also taught me, through 43 years of marriage, that love sometimes means leaving a door open even when you have every right to slam it shut. "I am not ready to forgive you," I said. "Not completely. Maybe not for a long time. But you can visit, we can talk. You can start showing me who you really are when you are not under her control. Trust is not given, Gavin. It is earned, and you have a lot of earning to do." Gavin nodded, tears streaming freely down his face. "I will spend the rest of my life trying," he whispered. "I swear to you, Dad. I will spend the rest of my life trying." I looked across the room at Rosalind's photograph on the mantel. The evening light caught her face at just the right angle, and for a moment, I could have sworn she was smiling. 6 months have passed since that evening in my kitchen when Gavin made his confession. The house looks different now. Sophie's textbooks are scattered across the kitchen table. Her backpack hangs by the door where Rosalind's cardigan used to be, and the sound of her laughter fills rooms that were silent for far too long. Linda comes over every Sunday evening, bringing desserts and stories and the easy companionship of someone who understands what it means to rebuild a life from grief. We are not a traditional family, the three of us, but we are a family nonetheless. The literacy program has tripled in size since the Time article. Volunteers I have never met show up every week, eager to help elderly immigrants learn the language that will open doors for them. We had to move to a larger space at the community center, and there is now a waiting list for new students. I teach 3 classes a week instead of 2, and every time I help someone write their name in English for the first time, I think of Rosalind. This was her dream. I am just the one carrying it forward. Sophie thrives in her new school. She transferred at the start of the semester, leaving behind the friends who knew her as Marissa's daughter and starting fresh somewhere no one had heard the story. Her college application essays are about her grandmother, about the letters that kept us connected, about the wisdom of a woman who saw the future clearly enough to prepare for it. She will get into any school she wants. I have no doubt of that. She visits Gavin on weekends now. Their relationship is healing, slowly and honestly, the way real healing happens. He picks her up on Saturday mornings and brings her back Sunday afternoons, and sometimes when she returns, I can see that she has been crying. But she also smiles more than she used to when she talks about her father. The man she is getting to know is not the puppet who sat silent at Marissa's side. He is someone trying, imperfectly but genuinely, to become the father he should have been all along. Marissa faced criminal charges for the forged power of attorney. Her lawyer negotiated a plea to a lesser offense, and she avoided prison, but the consequences followed her anyway. She lost her real estate license. The divorce settlement stripped her of any claim to Gavin's finances or future earnings. Last I heard, she had moved to another state, starting over somewhere. No one knew her name. I do not wish her ill. I simply do not think about her at all. Gavin visits me once a month. We sit on the porch and drink coffee and talk about small things. Sophie's grades, the roses I am trying to replant in Rosalind's garden, the weather. We do not talk about the lost years. Not yet. That conversation will come when we are both ready for it. For now, it is enough to share space, to rebuild familiarity, to learn who each other has become. Last week, I was cleaning out the hall closet when I found an old video camera I had forgotten existed. The battery was dead, but I charged it overnight, and the next morning I pressed play. The screen flickered to life, and there was Rosalind. The video was from our 40th anniversary, a party Linda had thrown for us in her backyard. Rosalind must have found the camera and recorded a message when no one was looking. She spoke directly to the lens, her eyes bright, her smile radiant. "Walter," she said, "if you are watching this alone, know that I am not really gone. I am in Sophie's laugh. I am in the garden you will plant. I am in every person you help read their first English word. Live well, my love. That is all I ever wanted for you." I watched the video 3 times. Then I closed my eyes and let her voice wash over me. For the first time in 8 years, the silence in my house did not feel like emptiness. It felt like peace. She had been right about everything. Living well was the best revenge. Not because it punished anyone, but because it honored everything she had given me. I stepped onto the porch where Linda was teaching Sophie to bake Rosalind's famous apple pie. Flour dusted their aprons and laughter spilled from the kitchen window. The evening sun painted everything gold, the roses, the porch railing, the faces of the 2 people who had become my world. I was not forgotten anymore. I was exactly where I was meant to be. If you have stayed with me through this entire story, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Walter's journey reminds us that it is never too late to reclaim our dignity, to find our people, and to build a life worth living. Sometimes the family we are born into disappoints us, but the family we choose can surprise us with love we never expected. Rosalind taught us something important. The best revenge is not cruelty or bitterness. It is simply living well. It is waking up each morning and choosing peace over anger, hope over despair, connection over isolation. Walter spent 8 years as a ghost in his own life, but he emerged stronger, surrounded by people who truly loved him. His story proves that no matter how long we have been forgotten, we can always be found again. I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been cut off from someone you loved because of another person's manipulation? Have you experienced the pain of family members who only showed up when they wanted something from you? Or perhaps you have been the one to rebuild a broken relationship, one small conversation at a time. Share your story in the comments below. Your experiences matter, and this community is here to listen. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another video. We share stories like this every week, stories of resilience, justice, and the quiet strength it takes to start over. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, no matter what you have been through, your best chapter might still be waiting to be written.